Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Annabelle Dick, tēnei, nau mai, haere mai, and welcome to this Visionweek presentation on the Infrastructure Commission's 30-year strategy. Today we will be discussing the strategy development program, the engagement timeline, and also sharing opportunities to contribute to the strategy development itself. As part of this session, we will be running a number of polls throughout to gather your feedback, and at the end of the session, we will be opening up the floor to questions from viewers. If you have any questions for our panelists, please submit these using the Q&A function on Zoom. Today on the panel, we have Jon Grayson, the Chief Executive of Infracom, Rob Addison, the Acting GM of Strategy, and Anna Verboeket, the Special Advisor in Engagement. We also have a couple of our board members joining for the Q&A panel too. On the line, we have Sue Tyndall, the former CFO of Auckland Council. She is our newly appointed Deputy Chair with a particular focus on outreach in regional New Zealand. We also have our board member, Stephen Selwood. Stephen is the former Chief Executive of Infrastructure New Zealand. Now I'll pass over to Jon Grayson to kick off this session.
Morena, and thank you very much, Annabelle. If we can go to the first slide, Annabelle. Our vision is for infrastructure for a thriving New Zealand, and we landed there because our activities, and particularly the 30-year strategy, have quite a powerful catalytic effect. The 30-year strategy can be a catalyst for productivity and well-being more generally. And we'll talk a bit about that as we go through. We're structured as an autonomous Crown entity. So that means we are independent of the government of the day, but we are advisory only. We have no pot of money to invest. We have no powers of direction. So how can we be effective? Well, we can be, and experience has shown in other jurisdictions that an independent body can be effective if we can build credibility with the sector and influence with decision makers over time. And that's where you come in, and we'll talk more about that later. The two legislated areas of responsibility that we have are, one, the strategy function, and that was a clear message coming from the sector during the engagement about whether we needed an independent body. That there was this missing strategic overlay. So while we had individual agencies planning well or to varying degrees, what was missing was that strategic overlay that brought those plans together to work towards a national vision. So we will be working on that 30-year, we have started work on that 30-year strategy. It will be supported as we go through by deep dives or special topic reports, which will support and feed into that 30-year strategy. The other area of our responsibility is procurement support. So we will sit alongside agencies and bring our particular expertise to assist them with delivery, procurement support. One of the most visible products from that area of our business is the infrastructure pipeline. Now that has been well received by the market in that it provides visibility of projects coming to the market, which allows the market to gear up, and if there's long-term certainty there, to commit long-term to this market. Before we move on, I mean, that pipeline actually is a good illustration about how all of our work comes together. So the pipeline, while it's providing certainty about projects that are coming to market soon, in order to get long-term certainty, there needs to be a strategic underpinning of projects that are coming down the track and feeding into the pipeline, replacing those that are going out. At the other end of the pipeline, it's important that we have an eye to whether the market is able to deliver those projects. So we have a focus on market settings. You know, are the supply chains efficient? Do we have the skills, etc., to be able to deliver those projects? Thanks, Annie. So coming back to how we can make a difference, this credibility and influence. And I think we will build that credibility with the sector, with you, if our work is evidence-based, that there's rigorous analysis behind all of our recommendations. Influence with governments across time is going to be a function of us having the likes of you behind us. So it will be much more powerful if we can build a consensus and build the strategy in collaboration with the sector. And if we can achieve that, then I think we can achieve bold reforms coupled with achievable pathways to getting to those reforms. So this is why it's important for you and how you can have a part to play in it. This is your chance. The 30-year strategy is your chance to have a say on our future infrastructure system. And that's important because the recommendations that we put to Parliament towards the end of next year must be responded to by government. It cannot be ignored. Next. Yeah. Thanks. So, especially in our first 30-year strategy, I think there will be a focus on building an infrastructure system that is agile, that is responsive, and has connected systems that help steer us towards that vision in the face of the disruptions we're now seeing, and the effects of those will only accelerate. The 30-year strategy needs to be outcomes focused. In other words, is the infrastructure system working for us? It is not a projects focus, and I think that is a trap that is easy to fall into. It is an outcomes focus. And if we focus on the outcomes rather than the projects, that opens up a whole lot more solutions. So it's not just about government investment, and it's worth noting that in New Zealand, between central and local government, they play a much more dominant role in the infrastructure system than in other jurisdictions. So that suggests that there are other solutions that are available for us at least to explore. So some of those solutions could be non-build solutions. In other words, pricing mechanisms to get the most out of existing infrastructure, or a combination of those non-build and investment by central and local government. Or it could be a bolder step towards reforming industry structure coupled with modern regulatory regimes. And as part of our 30-year strategy, we will also be focusing on the rules in which the system operates. So the integrated land use planning, the consenting systems, etc. Thank you, Annabelle. I'll hand over to Rob.
Thanks, John. And look, just really to expand on John's comments, I really just want to speak about the approach that we will take to developing the 30-year strategy. And I'll start with our legislation. And our legislation requires us to develop a strategy that will assess the ability of infrastructure to meet community needs now and in the future. And then from that assessment, identify priority reforms or initiatives that will help us achieve better infrastructure outcomes over the long term. So as John has said, those reforms or initiatives will be presented as recommendations to the Minister for Infrastructure, recommendations for change that will be reflected in the strategy. And as John has said, those recommendations need to be bold, and we need to propose important, but perhaps challenging or difficult recommendations. So for us to present a compelling program of recommendations, we need to demonstrate broad agreement from central government, local government, and the market, communities, yourselves and others on the direction forward. Next slide, please, Annie. So with that in mind, we really are relying on you and your input to this process, and we will talk briefly about how you can get involved in that. We also plan to be outcomes focused, and look, we are less interested in the structural integrity of assets and instead focused on the quality of services that people are receiving from their infrastructure. So we're putting people at the centre of our strategy. We also want to avoid looking at infrastructure sectors in their silos, and instead we want to understand how different assets and networks are coming together to contribute to the well-being needs of New Zealanders. For example, maybe the answer to addressing problems in the correction system isn't about building more prisons, but might be about more green spaces, libraries, swimming pools, and other civic amenities. Thanks, Annie. So in this slide, I just want to briefly talk you through the component parts of the strategy development process, starting with the evidence base, which is where we're at now on the left-hand side. And this is a collection of data and information to understand the state of critical assets and networks around the country now. And as I say, these are focused primarily not around just purely structural integrity of assets, but actually the performance of those assets and the experience that people, that New Zealanders are experiencing from those assets. So we're building that database now, and that has largely been drawn from publicly available sources like long-term plans and other written reports, but we'll also be coming to asset owners with a comprehensive survey in the coming weeks to get a view from the ground about the state of assets within communities around the country. Once we have that sort of solid stocktake or database, we want to couple that with performance indicators so that we can start to analyse the performance of different sectors to try and get an understanding of where there are things are going well in certain sectors versus other areas that might need increased focus. So bringing together the evidence base and the performance indicators brings together the infrastructure needs assessment, which really is the completion of our evidence base. From there, we want to then move into looking at the performance gaps. And this is really about analysing and understanding what's underpinning some of those performance gaps and what some of the causes are. And we really want to avoid just diagnosing the symptom and really dig deep into some of the systemic long-term policy barriers that might be getting in the way there. So rather than just focusing on, a bit like the iceberg metaphor, rather than just focusing on what's sitting above the surface, we want to dig down deep into the matters that sit beneath that might be causing long-term issues. Issues like governance arrangements, or funding and financing arrangements, or procurement incentives. Things like that, those are the things we want to really be able to dig down into. And we want to do that with stakeholders. It's critical that we have, that's a process of co-development with people like you and others across the sector. As I've already said, we're conscious that there are cross-cutting themes that touch on all infrastructure sectors. Things like funding and finance and resilience and disruption. And so we want to work with stakeholders to identify what are the appropriate cross-cutting themes that we need to be looking at. and take a focus on. And we're also conscious that what we know today doesn't necessarily tell us what we're going to need in the future. And so in keeping with our 30-year mandate, we are building in a strategic foresight program, which you can hear more about this afternoon when our colleague Richard McGeorge presents on this in more detail. But really, our strategic foresight program is about identifying a series of possible, probable future scenarios within which we need to plan our infrastructure, not with the view necessarily of trying to predict the future and land a hole in one, but instead actually predict a range of possible futures so that we're at least getting onto the green. And so that represents the culmination of the 30-year strategy. I'd now like to pass back to Annabelle. As I understand, we want to just ask participants to take part in a brief poll, but I'll hand that back to you, Annie.
Thanks, Rob, and kia ora koutou. We'll now be launching a poll with a couple of questions. Both of these, you have the option of lodging your responses anonymously if you don't want your personal information to be shared. And at the end of voting, we'll share the results back so people can see what others say. We'll give the poll probably another 20 to 30 more seconds, just waiting for a few more responses, and then we can share the results. Great, thank you everyone. I'll now pass over to Anna Verboeket to chat a little bit more about our engagement timeline.
Good morning, and I wonder if you could take us to the next slide, please, Annie. My name's Anna Verboeket. I'm the Special Advisor to Infocom, and also on the call is our new General Manager of Engagement, Tracy Kai. I wanted to pick up on some of the themes that John's mentioned around engagement, particularly our desire to collaborate with stakeholders, to work together with them on the development of the strategy, with a view to arriving at as great a degree of consensus as possible. This is going to be really something quite new for New Zealand. It's the first time that New Zealanders will get to have a say about the infrastructure they want and the sort of life they want to lead, because previously these strategies have been developed by officials in Treasury. However, we are an autonomous Crown entity, as John said, providing independent advice. And this offers us the chance to really engage with you to determine what our future looks like. As John said, it's going to be far harder for an infrastructure minister to reject a strategy that has been co-designed in a collaborative fashion to which the majority of New Zealanders agree. I want to tell you about how we're going to engage with our stakeholders and how we categorise them. We've got two kinds really. We've got those who can provide us with evidence, the subject matter experts, and we've got everyday users who have experience of the infrastructure. We categorise our stakeholders along the lines that Infrastructure New Zealand originally defined, and these basically take a scan across the ecosystem within infrastructure. Everything from governance at one end, as you can see on the slide here, through to the regulators such as Commerce Commission, funders, financiers, the owners who are in fact the asset managers and planners, the delivery partners such as the construction companies who come in to build, and then the users including peak bodies. Now every sector has this system operating in it from end to end, and the sectors of course include everything from energy through to the three waters, transport, as well as vertical infrastructure. Continuing to outline our stakeholders, we've also got some reference groups that we'll be drawing on, and we're establishing these at present. First of all, we have a group that we're calling Visionaries. Now, these people are really there to provide expert analysis and recommendations in their fields of subject matter expertise, which are the areas that our legislation requires us to take account of, including changing climate, environment, technology, population, and demographics. Then we've got a group we're calling Critical Friends, and this will be essentially our key reference group of evaluators who can provide a first-hand review of our materials before they go out for wider engagement. In terms of Māori engagement, we're working with Te Arawhiti, the Crown Māori Relations Office, to look at the ideal form of engagement, be it a reference group or otherwise. In any case, we want to absolutely reassure you that Māori will be involved throughout our reference groups and across our stakeholder engagement and the programme. Finally, Local Government New Zealand has very kindly formed an infrastructure group to work with us, and we'll be engaging with them on the settings they need at a regional, spatial and catchment level. They'll also assist us in providing the checks and balances we need as the strategy is developed. Annabelle, could I have the next slide, please? Folks, this is very much an approximate timeline. I hope you'll respect the fact that we're seeking to share as much information with you as we can today, but please don't hold us to account to the absolute week that we're setting out here. We're simply giving you an outline to give you the best information we can at this point. So as Rob said, what we're going to be doing is essentially building that evidence base through the Asset Owners Survey. You can see there, September, October, we intend to conduct regional and national workshops and focus groups. And then take submissions on the evidence base before the infrastructure needs assessment is completed in around January. Come February, next year, we'll be looking to run a second Asset Owners Survey. That's in case the first one conducted in July is too skewed by any COVID response. Then we'll be going into another round of regional and national workshops on strategic recommendations this time. We will have moved from if you can recall Rob's chevron diagram, we will have moved by this stage from having constructed the infrastructure needs assessment. Now we're looking to build recommendations from that. Those will be supplemented by a survey of users to gauge what they think about those recommendations. And we'll be working closely with asset owners as we develop them. Then we'll be looking to take submissions on a draft strategy, and that'll be tested before it's finally presented to the Infrastructure Minister in September 2021. As you can see there, there's another 6 months until a final strategy is presented to Parliament, during which time Infracom and the Minister have opportunities to amend the strategy. Could I go on to the next slide, please, Annie? Folks, this is just to let you know how we intend to work with you. We really want to be known for our ability to take account of user experience and community expectations, to provide that high quality evidence base that John was talking about, but also to be an independent voice that is future focused and transparent. Now, in line with that transparency, this slide is intended to show you when we will be coming back to report to you on a regular basis throughout the strategy development on how it's going. So you can expect to see those submissions on the evidence base published. You can expect to see the infrastructure needs assessment and initial themes emerging being published. Then later on in May, after the users survey, you'll see the results of those, and again the submissions on the draft strategy. Of course, when it's tabled in Parliament, everybody will see the final result. So we'll be regularly publishing findings and feedback that we've heard from you throughout development. At the same time, we'll be wanting to check in with a number of quick and easy surveys just to determine stakeholder satisfaction with the process so that we can be responsive throughout the course of strategy development and not wait until the end to hear from people. In that spirit of collaboration, we're going to invite you to take part in another poll now to let us know your thoughts on the development process and this engagement that we've outlined. In this case, we'd quite like to be able to trace responses back to you so that we can follow up on any issues arising. We've got 3 multi-choice questions we'd like you to answer, and the results will be shared with you. Annabelle, I wonder if you could launch the poll, please.
Absolutely. We've just launched the poll with 3 questions. Please use the grey scrolling bar on the side just to scroll down and see the other 2 questions below. We'll give you about a minute, just over a minute, to share your responses, and on conclusion, we will share the responses back with you. Kia ora, and thank you all for the feedback on that poll. Really interesting to gauge how you feel about our engagement plan and when you would like to engage with us. All the responses have been shared with the data you registered for this webinar with, so we would like to use this to follow up with you each individually after this and to be able to work with you the way that you would best like.
Thanks, Annabelle. So this is just to, in closing, please keep in touch with us. We've got a great newsletter running. You can sign up for it on our website, and we've also got a presence on LinkedIn. So we're really eager to hear from you. Let us know what's important to you as we proceed with this strategy, and we look forward to engaging with you.
Thanks, Anna. Matane mamano karapa te whai. Thank you, everyone. That brings the end of the presentation, but now we open up the floor to questions from our viewers. Just going to the Q&A now. Question, here's one for you, John. Will the pipeline have housing developments included?
Annabelle, no, it won't. Well, it will have the infrastructure that supports those housing developments. I think it's important for us to consider the scope of what we're looking at. Infrastructure are those big fixed assets, generally of a monopolistic nature, that support activity like housing. So it has a really important role to play, but we don't extend to the houses themselves.
Thanks, John. And on one of your slides, you noted the education sector as an area you're looking at. Can you elaborate more on the local workforce development to supply and support the strategy? Are you considering that?
Yes, one of the things I mentioned with the pipeline was that both ends, or outside of both ends of the pipeline, are really important. At the upper end, the strategy, so you've got a strategic underpinning to give you some confidence about the long-term flow of projects into the pipeline. But coming to this question, out the other end, it's important that we have a focus on the market settings. Is the market in a state where it's able to deliver on the projects coming out of the pipeline? And we have been very active, for example, on the construction sector accord, and workforce capability and supply has been a key focus of that. So the answer is yes, we are keenly interested in workforce development to support the delivery of infrastructure.
John, another question for you. You mentioned the impacts of COVID-19 accelerating and the extent to which local and central government investment impacts on infrastructure direction. How significant are those two short-term variables in your 30-year plan?
So I think COVID has impacts at a number of levels. One is the immediate impact, and COVID has, I think, exposed some flaws in our system, and so the government has been looking at, for example, how do we fast track projects through the consenting system. So we look at that and say, well, if we need to fast track those projects now, is there an underlying problem with our consenting system that COVID might have exposed, but we should be dealing with for the long term? In the short term, we're also dealing with infrastructure as a stimulus lever, and that has with it certain risks but opportunities. The risks are that if we invest in projects now, we almost certainly are reinforcing the status quo. And that's okay in certain areas where we're comfortable with the status quo. But where there are sectors that need reform, we have to be very careful about how we direct that investment. How can we direct that investment to achieve the reform that is needed to achieve the longer term outcomes? The other level at which COVID, I think, impacts is on our, how does the future look in light of COVID? We as an organisation, as I'm sure all of you, have worked remotely through this period. And I think just from Infracom's point of view, some of the way we've worked during this period will change forever the way we work. It's been great to be back in the office and have that personal interaction, but I think the balance of face-to-face meetings versus this type of engagement will change. And as I posed the question the other day on one of the other Visionweek sessions, does that mean now that broadband is a competitor to our transport system? So those sort of questions, and the other question, of course, is will it change people's preferences for where they live and how they live? You know, there has been a push to intensification in our development. Will that slow or reverse? So COVID-19 challenges us on a number of fronts, Annie, both short-term and very long-term.
Thanks, John. Another really interesting question. Perhaps you could answer this one, John. How does this commission interrelate with the Productivity Commission, which has made lots of good recommendations that governments have so far, or governments have ignored?
Yep, really good point. And we certainly don't want to duplicate the good work that they're doing. The chair and I have met with the chair of the Productivity Commission. We agree that there is no point in us duplicating each other's work. And so where there is potential for duplication, we will work together. But more likely, I think you'll see the Productivity Commission dealing with economy-wide productivity settings and us focusing more on industry structure and regulation. So that's good point. And I guess we are working with the Productivity Commission to make sure that we complement each other's work.
Anna, a question here for you, perhaps you can expand on. I notice Māori involvement throughout is mentioned under engagement. Infrastructure is resource dense and ultimately in its current forms, detrimental to Papatūānuku and Te Ao. Te Tiriti requires partnership. Māori should be your fundamental expert advisors and co-designers. Anna, perhaps you could chat a little bit about how we plan to engage with Māori.
Sure, thanks, Annabelle. Look, absolutely, Māori are partners, not just stakeholders in this process. We are working, as I said, closely with Te Arawhiti, the Crown Māori Relations Office, and taking their advice and the advice of others as to how best to engage. Certainly our Minister has let it be known that he would like us to work at a runanga and an iwi level. We have in mind the opportunity to form a reference group, possibly in partnership with the Climate Change Commission, because we do know that there's a great deal of fatigue out there in terms of some of the many programs that government and other agencies have underway. So we will certainly be looking to form that reference group or take on any other form or structure as advised by Te Arawhiti. But further to the point, we talked about visionaries, about critical friends, and then about some of those other reference groups. And we would expect that Māori would be represented on those reference groups as well as in a very specific form, and furthermore at a local level through the regional and then national workshops.
Annabelle, could I just reinforce what Anna is talking about? I think input from Māori is really important. Māori are the original long-term thinkers. We're talking about a 30-year strategy, which probably for Māori is short-term. So I think we have a lot to learn from Māori when it comes to a long-term perspective for infrastructure. At a more practical level, Māori now have significant investable funds for which they take a long-term investment horizon. So I would be keen to explore the opportunities for Maori to take a more active role in investment in the system.
Thanks, John.
Great, thanks team. Rob, perhaps you can answer this question. 2 years seems like an age to develop the strategy. Can that be accelerated at all?
Well, it does seem like a long time. There is a lot to get through in that time. And I think if we want to do this the way we've described, which is driven by consensus and underpinned by the idea that the evidence base and recommendations are co-developed, that is going to take time and it's going to take extensive engagement. But I think that's essential to make this work. I mean, as you've heard from us already, if we're going to present a compelling set of recommendations to ministers that are important, but are potentially difficult things to have to front up to, it won't be enough for that to just be an interesting central government think piece. You know, it has to have the fingerprints of central government, local government, the market, communities, and others. And so, you know, we want to take the time to do it right for this first strategy and make sure that we actually are able to present something at the end of this that is really compelling for ministers.
Thanks, Rob. And I'll let anyone from the panel answer this, but perhaps John or Rob or Anna, you might want to respond to this. What's the relationship with the National Climate Change Risk Assessment and National Climate Change Adaptation Plan?
So, Annabelle, this one comes down to, it's really a similar question to the productivity question, Productivity Commission. So we have already engaged with the Climate Change Commission. Our two leadership teams have got together, again, wanting to make sure that we're not duplicating each other's work. So whilst we will take an independent view and we will take our views from the market, we will draw heavily on the work of the Climate Change Commission in doing that.
I think to add to that, I mean, that risk assessment exercise is something that we would draw upon as part of our evidence base for the strategy. But then there's probably a role for ourselves to provide some advice around, if these are the risks that we need to mitigate at a national level, then what are the infrastructure choices that need to be made to help achieve those? And we'd probably come at that from a system perspective, if there are any policy or regulatory type barriers that perhaps are getting in the way of addressing some of those risks. But I think there's certainly a role for us to potentially be using our expertise to help address some of the risks that are identified there.
Thanks, Rob. And another question for you, Rob. Is there a people employment focus as part of the strategy, given the effects of COVID-19 on New Zealand's workforce and employment?
Yeah, potentially, absolutely. And I think that will be one of the many wide-ranging issues that we look at when we complete our evidence base and start to try to dig into, excuse me, just losing my voice, dig into some of the issues that we are able to dig out from the evidence base. So if we can point to the fact that there are skills and labour gaps, for example, and that is proving to be a systemic issue that needs addressing, then absolutely that would be a candidate for a recommendation that we would look to present to ministers. Thanks,
Rob. And I'll leave this question with the panel for anyone to answer. What focus, if any, will be placed on investment in the resilience of critical infrastructure to major New Zealand hazards and risks in the strategy development for both existing and future infrastructure?
I think that's a critical underpinning. Resilience, I think, has a number of dimensions to it. It's a resilience, and the question may well be based on resilience to natural hazards, I guess, perhaps related to climate change. That's definitely got to be part of building a resilient system that can cope with these sort of challenges. But it's not just resilience to those natural hazards either. We're seeing, technology changing at a rapid rate. And that will impact the way we use our infrastructure systems and the way they need to be built to adapt to and take an opportunity, seize the opportunity out of the technological changes. The electricity sector, I think, is a classic example of that. So whilst the electricity system, particularly the infrastructure component of it, transmission and distribution, was once a very boring one-way system, a one-way flow of electrons from a producer to the consumer, to your household, to factories, etc. In the future, that won't be the case. There will be a disruption which changes the way we use our electricity networks. A good example is that houses will no longer just be places for shelter, but will be electricity producers in their own right. And so rather than the one-way flow of electrons, those micro producers, being houses, will be trading electrons into the market. So there's that distributed generation which changes the nature of our distribution systems. There's the rollout of electric vehicles, for example. So all of these things, they are the really important things that we need to have an eye to, building an infrastructure system that can not only deal with those challenges, but turn them into opportunity.
Thanks, John. And a question on strategy, Rob. The proposed strategy is missing a vital element, infrastructure design. Is that something being looked at as part of the strategy?
If by infrastructure design, the person is referring to sort of the design of assets and things like that. Look, I'm inclined to think that might be slightly outside the scope of what we're primarily focused on here, which is about thinking about the long-term needs of infrastructure in New Zealand. Our view is that actually there are, if you want to get better long-term enduring outcomes, there are a number of systemic issues that need to be addressed to make sure that we make change that is enduring. And the majority of those long-term systemic issues actually come back to the policy settings, things like the governance arrangements that underpin infrastructure decision-making, or the arrangements by which funding and financing decisions are made, or regulation, things of that kind. So look, infrastructure design is very important, and it's an important input, and potentially something that the other side of our shop, the major projects advisory team, is potentially better placed to provide a view on. But I think in terms of the strategy, I think at least our primary focus is going to be around how can we make changes to how infrastructure is delivered that will make long-term systemic change. And as I say, I think that really lends itself more to the long-term policy, the policy choices that have to be made. Yeah.
Thanks, Rob. Another question for you. The first poll you ran reinforced that there's a desire for greater integration between infrastructure and other services. Will there be a commitment to exploring this in the strategy? Because the silos are real at the moment. Do you have any ideas at the moment?
Oh, look, absolutely. And this is exactly why the starting point for us is thinking about kind of people's experience of infrastructure and the quality of service that they're getting, and also focusing on the outcomes, which is exactly why we're less interested in the structural integrity of looking at assets within their silos and actually thinking about the quality of service that people get out of it. And absolutely, there are natural synergies between different infrastructure sectors, and it's why we were very interested to see what the audience thought about what some of the stronger synergies might be. And John's already alluded to one around transport and communications. So look, that has to be a core part of what we do. What are the opportunities, I suppose, to leverage off sectors that will ultimately lead to better outcomes and enhance the experience that people get from infrastructure, while working within the constraints that we all face as infrastructure decision makers, whether it's financial constraints or whatever it else might be. So look, absolutely. I mean, that is the people element and the connections between sectors is absolutely essential to the strategy.
Yeah, and Annabelle, Rob mentioned earlier, I think, a great example, and that is an anecdote that we picked up and we loved from a different jurisdiction when they were looking at developing their 30-year strategy, and went to the Chief Justice to seek his views on what sort of infrastructure he needed to support, the growing demand on the justice system, to which the response was more green space, please. In other words, reduce the demand on the system, don't just necessarily build for, the demand we currently have. So I think the outcomes focus, rather than on projects, is important in bringing together and connecting the various parts of the system.
Thanks, John. We'll take about 3 more questions after this before wrapping up. I'm just going to quickly respond to one now about getting a copy of the presentation and recording. We are recording this session and we will be making it available on our website so you can access this and revisit it and see the information we shared in the presentation. I will open up this question to the whole panel. How will you make the strategy visible and understood to the youth of today, being adults of tomorrow?
Well, they really are the beneficiaries, aren't they? In 30 years' time, this infrastructure really has a very long lead time. Long lead time in planning it, long lead time in delivering it. And so if we get it right, we leave an amazing legacy for the next generation. Get it wrong and we are paying the costs of that for a very long time. Hence the focus on engagement, and that engagement has got to be the people, that sector of the community that is going to live with these long-term decisions in the future, i.e. the youth of today. That will be a very important voice.
I'll add to that, I guess, to say, look, we're very cognizant of all kinds of different segments of interest in what we're doing. Youth is key. We're ensuring that there will be a youth voice on our visionaries group to guide us from that perspective. Now, that reference group won't be the only opportunity for youth to be involved. We'll also be seeking youth involvement in regional and national workshops. One of the great things about a number of the industry peak bodies we work with, for example, Tuans, they've got a great Flint Young Telecommunications Executives Network. That's a sort of group that we'd look to connect with across all sectors, as well as just in the general population.
Thanks, Anna. John, perhaps this is a question for you. We need a strategy where government and the private sector can work together to get the best outcome for the country. Some governments have historically not been interested in working with the private sector. Will your commission work towards breaking down these political hurdles and getting the best outcome for New Zealand?
I think it's critical that we do. And, part of that is, delineating who's responsible for what. And if I could just go off on a tangent for a moment, one of the areas of focus would be the relationship between central government and local government. So we were pleased, for example, to see the Resource Management Review Panel recommending a series of regional spatial plans, which I think is a great basis for central and local government to understand their responsibilities and contribution to placemaking, but back that up with city deals or regional deals that link funding to it. I also mentioned earlier that that central government and local government are the dominant players in in our infrastructure system, and that will, remain the case, I think. But I think that does suggest, given that they are more dominant than in other jurisdictions, it does mean there is scope to at least consider a greater role for the private sector. And that's why industry structure and regulation are an important focus of the 30-year strategy. So delivering things in a very different way. So instead of some infrastructure being delivered, and funded out of central government or local government budgets, maybe there's scope to change the structure of the industry so that there's an ability, at least, for private sector or third parties like iwi to participate more directly. And I think, the relationship between the private sector and government has been a more immediate focus as well through the construction sector accord. And we have been heavily involved in that. And one of the areas I think that where we could get some tangible benefits out of a more productive relationship between government and private sector is in the procurement space, is in the how we allocate risks between central government or the procuring agency and private sector contractors. And that comes down to government being a smarter procurer. In other words, looking for how we can deliver better value, not necessarily lower cost outcomes.
Thanks, John. And we'll finish with this last question. I'll open it up to the panel. For your users survey, what information do you propose to gather from users, and how able are they to provide insights at a level that will inform your strategy, as opposed to comments like, my local school needs a new hall? So how can they provide data and insights for the strategy?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And really, it's all, the design of the survey is intended to be part of the evidence base that I described earlier. And so rather than trying to steer away from perhaps the individual project needs within different parts of the country, we're really just trying to understand, get a council view or an EDB view or whoever the asset owner is, to try and understand what's your take on the state of your assets, what's your ability, how do you feel about your ability to deliver maintenance or capital programs over the next period of time? What are the big constraints that you're facing? It's really trying to understand that and get that sort of version of events direct from the source, so that we can then present that back as part of an evidence base. And really the intent behind that is, I like to think of it as a call for evidence, that actually this is about the sector as a whole coming together to co-develop an evidence base, which then underpins the vision and the set of recommendations that we will put together to ministers at the end of this process. So it's very much about collectively building an evidence base, but the survey in particular is about trying to get a version of events directly from more asset owners themselves.
Rob, if I can just add to that, I think the question was about the users survey. So that'll be coming later when we go to the stage of building recommendations. And the attendee posing the question is quite right. We're not seeking evidence from users, we're seeking evidence from subject matter experts. I guess you could say we're seeking experience or opinion from users on a number of recommendations at a later stage. And that's why what we sought to explain earlier in the presentation where we've got different kinds of stakeholders, some who are subject matter experts who can provide that evidence base, and others who are users of the infrastructure who can provide us with a view of what it's like to use it, their experience and their opinion, in particular on recommendations. So that's really the difference between the two groups, and that's how we'll be looking to run the users survey on recommendations as opposed to the asset owners survey, which is part of building the evidence base at the outset. I hope that explains.
Great, thank you, Anna. And that brings our session to a close. I would like to thank you all for attending today. We are running another session today at 2 p.m. looking at futures and strategic planning around future scenarios. If you'd like to register, go to the Visionweek website and you can register your interest there. Noho ora mai, stay safe and have a great weekend.